Welcome to Unleash Podcast. Our mission is to equip and inspire emerging leaders to take holistic approaches to lead themselves, their family, and the community. In this podcast, we will bring in expert insights to enrich your leadership journey. We are so glad you're tuning in, and let's unleash your leadership potentials.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're listening to our podcast. Good to see you again. Good to have you again with us today for our Unleash podcast. Today, we're going to keep digging in and keep dialoguing about leadership subject. And we have a special guest and good friend of mine joining us today from Atlanta, Georgia. His name is Steven Rubado. And Steven, I think we met a few years ago through one of my board member, Rachel. I met you at Chick-fil-A headquarters, right? And I still remember, you came down in a lobby and we talked, and that's how this relationship started.
Right. Yeah, it was such a pleasure to meet you back then and just hear about the exciting things that you've been a part of. And so I'm really very thankful to be here with you today, all of you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. So to start, tell us about yourself, your background, and what you do.
A little bit about my background. I'm actually part Thai and then part American. My mom came from Thailand, and so that informs a lot of my worldview and culture and everything. Being but half and half is what they call it from Thailand. But I love traveling. I love different cultures, and so that's kind of represented in the fact that my family and I, we lived overseas in India for almost a decade, and I've traveled to 25 plus countries. And I love how God's created different cultures and seeing the unique nature of the way that the nuances of the way that cultures live and the way people interact with one another. And so that's a real passion of mine. On the topic of leadership, since we'll be talking about that today, it's a real deep burden of mine. And so one of the things I've kind of fallen down on is this idea that leadership, organizations and families and communities rise and fall on this idea of leadership. And my experience is kind of speaking to that in terms of my role with LifeShape. LifeShape itself is kind of our main focus, is this idea of opening doors for marketplace professionals to have life-changing experiences by serving those in need around the world. So what we do is we mobilize marketplace professionals, namely Chick-fil-A is one of our organizations that we mobilize, and we send them the opportunities to serve around the world, doing things from anything from helping young girls and boys rescue out of human trafficking to training business entrepreneurs to talking just about leadership principles. And so we love doing that. We love seeing the impact that happens from that. I serve as our director of relationships and so oversee a lot of the marketing and mobilization efforts, stewardship, and just overall training for us as an organization.
Well, on behalf of our audience and on behalf of our show, welcome to Unleash Podcast. And we're looking forward to our following dialogue with Steve, deeper into his just nuance and his learning of or even his background and experience about leadership. So you did started touching about, leadership. You have a burden for that. When and what made you start discovering and learning about leadership subject? In which stage of your career and where? And you started really thinking, wow, I'm passionate about this subject. Not only that, I admire great leaders. I want to be great leaders. When did that start?
I feel like it started fairly early on in my leadership experience. I was looking at the numbers on this and looking back in the years, and probably in terms of a formal leadership role, I've been involved in leadership for about 28 plus years now. And so just in thinking through that from pretty early on, I saw pretty quickly the powerful impact, both for positive and negative, that leaders can have on those that they lead, on organizations, on communities. And so from that early on point, I began to realize just the need to very quickly begin learning, well, how do I be a good leader? How do I kind of lean towards that positive of impact upon others? And so just began looking at, mentors and trying to just to be a very avid reader and learner about what principles were out there. And so that's really been my history just from very early on, just seeing the need for good leaders. And one of the things I've kind of fallen down on is this, what I feel called to in terms of developing leaders is really to focus on developing leaders of integrity and purpose. So essentially, leaders that get the job done and then do the right thing. Sometimes we feel like, especially as we look at leaders today, that those have to be separate or different. They can't coexist. But I firmly believe that we can have leaders out there that, again, are leaders of integrity. They do the right thing, and they can also get the job done. So.
Yeah, that's true. So it doesn't matter in the East or West or a different part of the world, even here in America. Typically, people recognize someone with more success or more achievement and power, or certain title, like even have a name card with a CEO or something on it, or have more money and more material ownership. Look at those people as leaders. So what do make someone a leader in your perspective? That what makes someone to be a greater leader?
Great question. Yeah, I think I pretty quickly realized, because you're right, there's a certain view of who leaders are, but that leaders, they're not, leadership is not a position. It is not even competency per se. It really is about influence, right? And so it's about our ability to impact the lives of others around us. So I really view leadership as an aspect of influence over others. And if you take that definition, then in reality, we are all leaders in some way, shape, or form. In some respect, we are all influencing those around us, whether we are a father, mother, whether we're a brother, a sister, leading in the community, a neighbor. We all have influence over the people around us. And so I view us all as leaders in one way, shape, or form. And again, as I think about that, I also think about this idea that the best leaders, in my perspective, are what we would call servant leaders. And I know that really is kind of countercultural, counterintuitive to a lot of the leadership that we see today. But this idea of servant leadership is just really important. And I know that may be a cliche term, or people may ask, well, what do you mean by that when you say servant leadership? And so at Chick-fil-A, who we work so closely with, as being a nonprofit of the Cathy family who owns and runs Chick-fil-A, and so servant leadership is such an important aspect of I think the way that Chick-fil-A does leadership and views leaders. And one of the definitions, as we look at servant leadership, the way that we define servant leadership is this idea of a leader compelled by the unshakable desire to serve. And I love that, because again, you go back to a leader, a person who has influence. Compelled, it's their why, by the unshakable. That means it's immovable. It's really a part of their DNA as a leader, a desire to serve, that center of who they are. And really, it's about this idea of adding value to other people. And so as a servant leader looks around them, they really do see this aspect of, wow, I've been entrusted as a steward over the people that are under my care, under my leadership. And so how can I add value who they are? And one of the neat things, you see this kind of all around in business gurus, they write different things. And Jim Collins is one that has written a lot of books around leadership. Good to Great is one of his more famous books. And in that, it's very interesting that he talks about this idea of a level 5 leader. And he identifies some key elements in terms of who a level 5 leader is. And two of the main aspects are, one, extreme personal humility. This idea that they consider others better than themselves, which is very interesting. And then also the second part of that is the idea of this intense professional will, this unwavering resolve to serve the mission and serve the people around them. And so I thought that was very interesting. Again, is is Jim Collins, who did a very intensive study about many organizations that were successful, identified level 5 leaders as one of the key ingredients to the success of that organization. And so going back to that, I think that a servant leader has an eye towards unlocking the tremendous potential of others around them.
So it's very different than countercultural to, like you said, it's from today's leader. Many leaders are driven by their own success, self-centered, what kind of recognition I can receive, what kind of name and title I can get, rather than really looking at the people that they serve, the people that they lead, the people that they run business with. How can I maximize their, potentials? How can I, get them to get to next level with us through the organization, through the business, what we do? Wow, that's certainly very, very different than today's leadership or what we culturally think of leaders, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, you said, your family, part of your family is from Thailand. Most of our audience are Mongolian speaking people from Mongolia, but also Mongolian people living around the world that listen to our podcast. Culturally, we're very similar to, Thai culture in some sense, because it's collective culture. We're from a seniority and power-driven culture, almost like top-down kind of approach when it comes to leadership, and that has worked, for many years, probably in a military campaigns and over the years. But when it comes to modern day society, modern day business, some of them it's not working as well. You talked about servant leader are the best leader. Then what are some examples of servant leader you admire personally that who have modeled this well, not only in the West, but also around the world that you recognize?
Absolutely. I think here in the U.S., obviously we have like George Washington, who I love the story of him. He had to be dragged into the leadership role of president, right? He didn't chase after it, but he was asked to serve, and he made an intentional choice to do that. Think of Abraham Lincoln, of course, in terms of his resolve to free the slaves who were here in America. As you kind of span across the world, you see leaders like Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, who led significant movements to lead their nations to freedom and to help in terms of the equality of others. So amazing leaders, Martin Luther King among those as well. And then, I think also Billy Graham, amazing leader who influenced so many others to serve them well and showed compassion and love to people. I think of a little bit closer to home and think about the Chick-fil-A family, specifically the Cathy family. And I think it's so interesting how you look at how leaders, they influence so many others around them. And so as you look at the Chick-fil-A organization, they were very heavily influenced by the Cathy family, Truett Cathy specifically, who modeled that leadership. And that trickled down to his kids, Dan, Bubba, and Trudy. And in the way that they perceive leadership, it's trickled down to the third and fourth generations of the Cathy family, and certainly to the Chick-fil-A leaders. It's really a mindset. It's an ethos or a part of the leadership culture here at Chick-fil-A to really look at how you can add value to other people and to serve others well, serve the mission well, and then serve people well. And so I really love that about the Chick-fil-A organization. And then finally, I do think of you can't think of servant leadership and not think of the person Jesus and how he led such an incredible movement, and it was based on serving other people. And so I love that, and that's kind of an ethos that is certainly being carried on as others who follow Jesus do the same thing.
Yeah, I had a privilege of meeting Mr. Truett Cathy just one time in person. Although, I heard a lot of, cases or examples of him living out servant leadership through his book, but also through other people. And one of my personal experience with that is also how Dan and Bubba and them modeled that. And my first time I ever met Dan and Bubba was in Shanghai. we were meeting up on this like really nice hotel, like buffet on the top. Kind of Chick-fil-A executives were in city, and Rachel was there. So Dan was asking me a question. We picked up our food and sit on the same table, and we were chatting. And Bubba was sitting next to me, and he was just listening. And then he walked away, and then he came back with a butter knife and butter, and then put it right next to me. And that just changed how I looked at leaders so much. I still remember that example, or that little deed that he did, that really not only impressed me, it really influenced me to think that, wow, leaders can really care about someone. I was nobody to them, doesn't have, anything I can add too much value to them. But he really, was paying attention to what I brought, and then I was missing pieces, and he walked away and grabbed that for me. And I certainly see that it's not only, just in your ethos. Actually, leaders really model that in your organization, and that's one of the reasons I do believe greater success contribute towards Chick-fil-A is because of this culture and because of servant leaders that you guys are modeling. So thank you again, and make an impact in my life.
Thank you for saying that. And it really is such a contagious thing, isn't it? I mean, when you see a leader like Bubba, who I've seen kind of chase people down in the halls here at the Chick-fil-A Support Center to greet them and welcome them as guests. I've seen Dan go around and pick up trash around the building as a way, because he cares for what's happening. And so it's just really neat to see it. It is very contagious.
Yeah. So if servant leader is such a contagious concept, it's one of the best way of leadership, then why servant leadership is not a norm around the world, and why people are not really considering it as a norm?
That's a great question. We kind of go back to what we talked about. It is so countercultural, I think, in so many different areas around the world. And so I think the common view is that people work their whole lives to get into leadership so that they can be served, so they can serve others. And so I think this goes back to human nature very, very much, and that our nature can be very selfish, that we're looking out for ourselves and what's most important for us. And I know, being a dad, I know that I don't have to teach my kids to be selfish and to want to keep things for themselves. I have to actually teach my kids to share with others and to be selfless. And so it really is this thing that is taught. It's a choice. It's intentional, and the world doesn't choose that way. We naturally don't choose to do that. And so I think what I've seen about this idea of servant leadership, it really is making a conscious choice to say, I want to think about others around me and add value to them. And it's almost a habit that you can develop, a skill over time. I know a good friend, he's a Chick-fil-A franchise owner in South Carolina, and his name's Matt. And one of the things he taught me was that he knew that naturally he wasn't very good at affirming people around him and saying positive things. And so he began to tell himself, I need to develop this as a habit. And so he would come into work every day with a right pocket full of pennies. And his goal by the end of the day was to move all those pennies from his right pocket to his left pocket. In order to do that, he had to say one affirming word to one of his restaurant team members, his workers, all throughout the day. And so at first it was really difficult to do. But over time, he developed it as a habit and made a conscious choice to speak life and to be affirming to those around him. And he was eventually able to make it into a habit where, he's constantly doing that now, and he doesn't have to think of it because it is a habit of his. He's made that choice.
Yeah. And you did touch it's a choice versus your your desire. Sometimes it's our own greed and our own ego and our own struggle of holding on to things, of power or recognition or all of that. Previously, I remember one of the training you did, we were talking about, most of the leaders today are driven by either fear or shame. Can you elaborate that a little bit? Why those leaders are toxic? Why those doesn't work?
Right. Two of the things you heard about this idea of ego, and so we all have an ego, and pride and fear are two things that really drive, if we're not careful, a lot of our decisions, and especially as leaders, that can lead us to negatively impact those around us, and as you say, create a very toxic environment if we are leaders driven by pride and fear, and so to compensate for that, we really have to make a conscious choice, again, to kind of serve in humility and to look at others around us. There's a quote from the Bible that talks about this idea of do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility consider others better than yourself. And so that's kind of the mindset, I think, that summarizes well of a servant leader, thinking others are better than themselves and placing value in other people, and making that conscious choice to do so on a regular basis. So it, again, goes back to that choice in overcoming the pride and fear in one's heart.
Yeah. Some of our listeners are young professionals and even student leaders, and while some are business owners and non-for-profit leaders and even church leaders or just regular people who go to church. What are some top things, each of these groups should focus on improving or developing and becoming a better servant leader in their sphere of influence? What do you recommend them to become a better servant leader?
Well, I really think this idea of humility is so important, and being a lifetime learner. And so kind of club that, saying, I look and see that there's value in other people around me. So taking notice of that value in others around you. And then I think as a leader too, it goes back to this idea of stewardship. And so if I've been given something to take care of it, then I need to value it and I need to see the potential in it. And so one of the things I've learned as a leader that I think has served me well, and that I like to encourage others to do, is as a leader, as you've been given leadership over others, one of your main jobs is to not only see people as they are, but see people as they could be. So kind of to be a people visionary and see the potential in people, and then call that potential out of people. And I think as we as leaders can quickly get to that point and develop that as a skill on how do you see the potential in others, then how do you develop people to grow and to reach that potential? Because when that happens, it affects the whole organization. It definitely helps you as a leader, because the team that you're leading and the organization you're leading does well. But I think it influences and affects the whole organization and others around you. It's very contagious, as we talked about before.
Yeah, like you said about developing people, a lot of organizations we face either start off a non-for-profit or even church. We always hit this bottleneck of leadership development pipeline. How do we develop more leaders? How do we do that? But then I think a lot of it to do with the top leaders. Top leaders don't have the vision of multiplying others, don't trust others, don't think people are qualified to be there. They only see people as it is, not seeing what they can become. And they always tend to forget when they were 20-something, when they were 30-something, they're probably in a worse place than these young guys they lead today. So thanks for just calling onto leaders, especially the leaders that are listening to our podcast. Please, invest in others and help others to become a best version of themselves and their potentials. And if you can, unfold those potentials, these people you lead, those people that serve under your organization, will be a tremendous blessing and tremendous asset to the mission and what you are trying to accomplish. Go ahead.
Which just to kind of elaborate upon that a little bit is I love what you're talking about, because it really is this idea of mentorship, which I'm a firm believer in. And so as a leader, you always need to seek out a mentor, make sure that that somebody's investing in you, helping you to grow and to grow your perspective, grow your skills. Then also make sure you're always seeking to mentor someone else, seeking to help them to grow and reach their potential. So it really is this two-way street or we're always seeking to grow, and we're seeking to help others grow as well.
That's right. And helping others grow, that could be it's a mission. It's such a fulfilling mission because, there's no other thing. I mentor some people and I do that just routinely. I don't think any other things, the reward I get is can replace with that feeling of the people you invest time and your wisdom and your training and your relationship with, seeing them grow and seeing them step up, seeing their leadership grow. That just reward is such I cannot describe it by word even sometimes. It's such a rewarding journey.
Gives you joy, fulfillment to see others under your stewardship be able to reach their potential. It really is.
That's right. Thing. Yeah, I remember last year, I was in Atlanta, Georgia by your invitation, attended LifeShape training. And you guys have touched about heads, hearts, and habits of the leaders. Could you explain those a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And so those are the 4 domains of the leader that we talk about. And the first of those domains, as you mentioned, is the heart. And it really represents kind of the motivations of a leader. And we talked a little while ago about pride and fear and how that can really inhibit the ability of a leader to help others around him succeed, him or her. And so the heart of leaders is really centered around this idea of ego, the pride and fear piece, and in a leader choosing not to act and live out of pride and fear, but to live and act out of humility and then confidence. And so with those together, that helps to keep the heart of a leader in check and focus on the right things. And then the next part of that is the head of a leader. And really that represents kind of the perspective of a leader, what a leader thinks, and the leader's view about others, about the purpose of why they lead, and going back to this idea of a servant leader and that conscious choice. And so the head of a leader really represents a leader saying to him or herself, I choose to not act out of pride and fear. I choose to value other people and then live out my leadership in that way. And so that's their perspective. It's a perspective of humility, out of humility, seeking to help others and accomplish the mission. And then the third part of that is the hands of a leader. And that really represents what leaders do, and how leaders actually lead others well, how they help others to grow, how they call out the potential in others. And those are the hands of a leader are firmly grounded in the leader's heart, his motivation, his or her motivation to be a leader, their perspective on why a leader leads. And then that, again, influences how they actually lead. And then the habits is really, I think, probably one of the most important things. And that the habits of a leader really represent those things that help a leader to stay on track, help a leader to keep their heart right, to keep their perspective about leadership correct, and therefore that influences how they actually lead others well in terms of the hands. And so habits like just seeking to have times of reflection and focus, to get grounded, to slow down life in many respects, and just those things that, again, keep you grounded in what's important. Habits like extending grace to other people, forgiving people. So all those being so much a part of what helps, again, keep a leader's heart right and their perspective right as well.
Wow, that's awesome to see that, the leadership area you're touching, and it's much more holistic. We're not just talking about performance. It's talking about really self-awareness of your head knowledge, your heart, your motivation, and your hard work, and also your habits. I think, those are things, daily associated with leaders, and for long haul, it really determine our not only performance, but also our true influence. So
right.
Today we talked about multiple area. We talked about servant leadership, and a couple things also stood out as you were sharing is you touch humility many times. So what are some resources and books that you are, it could be website resource, it could be books or other resources you recommend about servant leadership, and how do I improve and get to better understanding about humility in those areas? Do you have any recommendation?
Yeah, there's a growing library of resources, I think, around this topic of servant leadership, especially over the last maybe decade. Especially, it's really become people have actually seen. Going back to our earlier point of some people would say, why would you choose servant leadership? And I think there are more and more examples of companies that have embraced this idea of servant leadership that are extremely successful. Because isn't that the determinator a lot of times of what leadership style you choose? And so people that have chosen servant leadership, Chick-fil-A being one example of a business that has chosen that, and it's led to a what is now a 10 billion plus business that is very successful, but is also valuing taking care of people. So having said that, this library of resources would include Robert Greenleaf is kind of the one who really coined the term servant leadership. And so he has an essay, The Servant as a Leader, is kind of the foundational resource I think I would recommend to people. The Greenleaf organization has also started a Center for Servant Leadership, which I think has a lot of great resources. And then you've got things like Ken Blanchard, who's written a number of books, one being Lead Like Jesus. We talked about Jesus, a great model for leadership before. He's also written the situational leadership. Him and Paul Hersey developed the situational leadership concepts, which is a very well-known leadership model, is used in many, many organizations. And that is really based on this idea of really serving others and adapting your leadership style depending on those that you lead and what they need from you as a leader. So again, a great resource. And then just within Chick-fil-A, one of our vice presidents, Mark Miller, he's written a number of books about Chick-fil-A's leadership model and style. The kind of foundational book being The Secret, again by Mark Miller, and kind of outlines our serve leadership model, which has some, just again, 5 great principles about how you can ground yourself in servant leadership. The S of the serve is the kind of the acronym. The S being seeing the future, seeing and shaping the future. E being engaging and developing other people. The R being this idea of reinventing continuously. B is valuing both results and relationships. And then the final E in the serve model being embody the values. And so all those kind of coining and being the center of how we perceive and look at leadership here at Chick-fil-A.
Yeah, listeners, we will list some of those resources, websites, and books that Steve mentioned on our show notes, and hopefully you can follow up those and find those resources would be helpful on your own discovery and learning journey on servant leadership as well. So we're getting towards the end of our podcast. So Steve, if our listener were to have one key takeaway that applicable, that they can apply in their life, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think one takeaway not to forget would just be this idea that leaders don't drift to greatness. And so it takes intentionality. And so my encouragement to everybody that's listening, if you don't take anything else away, it's this one thing of be very intentional about becoming the leader that you want to be. It's not just going to happen. It's going to take effort. It's going to take intentionality in a daily choice.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. It's a great pleasure having you on our podcast. And thanks again sharing your wisdom and sharing your ethos about leadership, and particularly on the subject of servant leadership with our audience.
My pleasure to be with you, Ballarhue, and thank you for all the great work that you guys are doing.
Well, if you're listening for our Unleashed Leadership podcast, feel free to whichever platform you're on social media or on podcast platforms, please rate our podcast, spread the word with your friends, even make some comments and leave some comments with what are some other subjects you would like to you would like to hear from experts that's through our podcast. It's our pleasure serving you guys. It's our pleasure walking with you on your leadership journey. Hope to see you next time. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Unleashed podcast was brought to you by Asia Leadership Development Network. In this podcast, we will discuss topics related to leadership, personal development, family, mental and emotional health, business entrepreneurship, organizational and community leadership, and more. For a better tomorrow, we strive today. Thank you for joining us.